The candle went out just as the door slammed shut behind her, and Alina Hartley found herself standing in complete darkness inside a house that was not her own, in a storm that showed no sign of stopping. Lightning cracked outside the tall windows of Ashcombe Hall, throwing pale light across the marble floor for one instant before the darkness swallowed everything again. Somewhere down the long corridor, a woman screamed, not from fear of the storm, but because she had stepped on the hem of her own gown and torn it clean through. Alina did not scream. She reached out one hand, found the cold stone wall, and began to walk toward the sound of voices. 6 hours earlier, none of this had seemed possible. Alina had not wanted to come to Ashcombe Hall at all. She had told her father as much twice, while he adjusted his coat in front of the small mirror in their front hall and pretended not to hear her. Baron Hartley was a proud man who had very little left to be proud of, and the invitation from the Duke of Ashcombe's household had arrived like a gift from heaven, even though Alina knew, deep down, that it was closer to an afterthought. "They need one more young lady to make the numbers even," her father had said, folding the letter with great care, as though it were made of gold rather than paper. "The Duke's grandmother insists on it. Something about wanting a full table." "So I am to be a place-setting," Alina had replied, and her father had laughed not because it was funny but because it was true, and there was nothing else to be done about it. The carriage ride to Ashcombe Hall took most of the afternoon, and Alina spent it looking out the window rather than at her own reflection in the small glass set into the door, unlike the other young women who had been invited, all of whom, she suspected, were spending their journeys practicing their smiles. She was not being unkind in thinking this. She simply knew her place in this arrangement, and her place was near the bottom of a very long list. The Duke of Ashcombe needed a wife. Everyone in 3 counties knew this by now, because his grandmother, the formidable Duchess Margaret, had made it known to anyone who would listen. The old woman was dying, slowly and with great dignity, and she had one wish left before she went, which was to see her grandson married before the year was out. If he failed to marry in time, the entire estate, along with the title itself, would pass to a distant cousin named Edmund Ashcombe, a man known mostly for his gambling debts and his complete indifference to the people who depended on the estate for their livelihoods. Alexander Whitmore, the Duke in question, had agreed to his grandmother's wish with the same expression he wore for most unpleasant tasks, which was to say, no expression at all. He had been engaged once before, years ago, to a woman named Charlotte Vance, and that engagement had ended in a way that left him with very little faith in matters of the heart. Since then, he had thrown himself into managing the estate, riding out at dawn to inspect the tenant farms, staying up late with the account books, and generally behaving like a man who had decided that duty was a safer thing to believe in than love. When his grandmother's list of candidates arrived on his desk, he had read through it once, without much interest, and set it aside. There were 12 names on the list. He recognized most of them from other gatherings, other dinners, other seasons spent watching young women laugh a little too loudly at his jokes and agree with everything he said. The 13th name, added almost as a footnote at the bottom of the page, belonged to a Miss Alina Hartley, daughter of a minor baron whose estate bordered the eastern edge of Ashcombe land. Alexander did not know her. He assumed he never would, not really, not the way a man is meant to know the woman he marries. The first gathering was held in the great hall of Ashcombe, with its high ceilings and its portraits of dead relatives staring down from every wall. Alina arrived in a gown that had been remade twice from an older one belonging to her mother, and she stood near the edge of the room while the other young women arranged themselves near the center, where the light from the tall windows fell most flatteringly on their faces. She watched the Duke long before he ever noticed her. He was taller than she had expected, with dark hair that had been combed into some semblance of order, and then immediately disturbed by the wind on his ride from the stables. He moved through the room the way a man moves when he has somewhere else he would rather be, offering short greetings, brief bows, and very little of himself. Alina found this more interesting than she expected to. Every other man she had met in rooms like this one seemed desperate to be seen. The Duke seemed desperate to disappear. It was during the 3rd hour of the gathering, while a string quartet played something slow and forgettable in the corner, that the accident happened. A young footman, carrying a tray of drinks toward a group of guests, caught his foot on the edge of a rug and stumbled. 3 glasses of wine went sailing through the air, and 2 of them landed harmlessly on the floor, but the third struck the pale blue gown of a young woman named Charlotte Ashwick, staining the fabric a deep and unmistakable red. Charlotte let out a cry that turned every head in the room, and the footman, a boy no older than 16, went white with panic. He began stammering an apology, his hands shaking, and it seemed for a moment that the entire evening might collapse into an embarrassment that would follow the poor boy for the rest of his life in service. Elinor moved before she had decided to move. She crossed the room quickly, pulled a clean handkerchief from her sleeve, and pressed it gently into Charlotte's hands, speaking in a low voice that only the 2 of them could hear. "Cold water first before it sets," she said. "Come, I'll show you. There is a room just through there, and no one will even notice you've gone." She guided Charlotte away from the crowd with a steady hand on her arm, and as they left, she turned back just long enough to catch the eye of the trembling footman. "You did nothing wrong," she told him quietly. "The rug is old and the edge has curled up for weeks. Tell the housekeeper it needs mending before someone worse than a wine glass gets hurt." The footman's shoulders dropped in relief, and he hurried off to fetch more drinks, his crisis forgotten. Elinor disappeared down the hallway with Charlotte, and neither of them returned for nearly 20 minutes, by which time the stain had been mostly cleaned, and Charlotte's tears had dried into something closer to gratitude. What Elinor did not know was that the Duke had watched the entire exchange from across the room. He had not moved to help, because helping was not expected of him, and because a dozen servants stood ready to manage exactly this kind of small disaster. But he had noticed the way the young woman in the plain gray gown had reached the footman's side before anyone else had even registered what had happened, and he had noticed, too, that she had not once looked around the room to see who was watching her act of kindness. She had simply acted, quietly and quickly, and then vanished as though she expected no credit for it at all. He asked his grandmother about her later that evening, once the guests had begun to retire to their rooms for the night. "Elinor Hartley," the Duchess said, settling back into her chair with the slow care of a woman whose bones had grown tired of carrying her. "Baron Hartley's daughter. I nearly didn't invite her, if I'm honest. Her family has fallen on hard times and she has no great fortune to offer, but something told me to add her name to the list." "What told you?" Alexander asked. His grandmother smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she knew more than she was willing to say. "An old woman's instinct, my dear, nothing more than that." "Why do you ask?" Alexander did not have a good answer, so he offered none, and excused himself to walk the grounds before retiring, as he often did when his thoughts refused to settle into any orderly shape. He did not see Elinor again that night, though he found himself glancing toward the east wing of the house, where the guest rooms were arranged, more than once during his walk. Elinor, for her part, sat by the window of her own room long after the candles had burned low, thinking not of the Duke, but of her father, and the debts he had not told her about, and the way he had looked at the invitation as though it were the last rope thrown to a drowning man. She did not come to Ashcombe Hall hoping to become a duchess. She came because her presence, however small, might ease her father's mind, and because refusing an invitation from the Duke of Ashcombe's own grandmother was not a luxury a family like hers could afford. She fell asleep with the sound of distant thunder rolling somewhere far off across the hills, not yet knowing that within a day, that same storm would arrive at Ashcombe Hall and change the course of everything that followed. The next morning brought clear skies and a full schedule of activities designed to let the Duke observe his candidates in a variety of settings, as though he were choosing a horse rather than a wife. There was a walk through the gardens, during which most of the young women competed quietly for a place at his side, asking him questions about the roses and the fountains that he answered with polite, distracted patience. There was a luncheon on the south lawn, where conversation turned to fashion and gossip from the capital, subjects Elinor knew almost nothing about and had no interest in pretending to know. She spent most of the walk near the back of the group, admiring the gardens for their own sake rather than as a backdrop for conversation. And it was there, examining a bed of late summer flowers, that the Duke found himself walking beside her without quite meaning to. "You have not asked me a single question all day," he observed, his tone carrying more curiosity than criticism. Elinor glanced up at him, startled to find him addressing her directly. "I did not think you wanted more questions, Your Grace. It seemed to me you had answered quite enough of them already." A short, surprised laugh escaped him, quickly suppressed, as though laughter itself were something he had grown unaccustomed to allowing. "That may be the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a fortnight." "I imagine most people tell you what they think you wish to hear," Elinor said. "It must grow tiresome." "It does," he admitted, and then, as if surprised by his own honesty, he changed the subject quickly, asking her about the flowers she had been examining. And she told him without embarrassment that her family's gardens at home had once been the finest in the county, before the money ran short and the gardeners had to be let go, one by one, until only the flowers that could survive on neglect remained. He found himself listening more closely than he had listened to anyone in a very long time. Their conversation lasted only a few minutes before other guests drew his attention away, but something had shifted, quietly and almost invisibly, like a single stone moved from one side of a scale to the other. Neither of them spoke of it again that day. But that evening, as the household staff began closing the shutters against a sky that had turned the color of a fresh bruise, and the first low rumble of thunder rolled across the hills, Elinor felt a strange certainty settle over her that this visit to Ashcombe Hall was not going to end the way anyone expected. By nightfall, the storm had arrived in full force, rain hammering against the windows and wind tearing at the old trees along the drive. And every guest at Ashcombe Hall would soon discover that the roads leading away from the estate had become impossible to travel until morning. No one, least of all Elinor, could have guessed what that single night would come to mean. The power failed within the hour, plunging Ashcombe Hall into a darkness so complete that even the servants, who knew every corridor of the great house by heart, found themselves reaching for walls to guide their steps. Candles were lit throughout the ground floor, but the wind found every gap in the old windows and snuffed out flame after flame almost as quickly as they were struck. The guests, stranded by roads too flooded and too dark to travel, gathered first in the drawing room, where the fire still burned steady and bright, throwing long shadows across the walls. Most of the young women reacted to the situation exactly as Elinor had expected them to. There was a great deal of complaining about ruined slippers, ruined hair, and the indignity of being trapped somewhere so far from the comforts of home. Lady Priscilla Ashwick, mother to Charlotte and the sharpest tongue among the visiting families, declared loudly that this was precisely the sort of disorganization one had to expect from a household run by servants rather than a proper mistress, a comment aimed less at the storm and more at the absence of a duchess in the house. Elinor said nothing to any of this. She had grown up in a home where storms sometimes meant far worse than ruined slippers, where a leaking roof or a flooded field could mean the difference between a comfortable winter and a hungry one, and she found she had little patience left for complaints about hairstyles when there were people in the house who might genuinely need help. She slipped out of the drawing room while the others were still arguing over whose fault the darkness was, and made her way toward the kitchens, following the sound of raised voices and the sharp, panicked cries of someone in pain. She found a small crowd of servants gathered around a young stable boy named Peter, no older than 14, who had been thrown from his feet by a gust of wind while securing the stable doors and had struck his arm against the stone wall. He sat on an overturned crate near the kitchen fire, his face pale, his arm cradled awkwardly against his chest, while the older servants argued over whether to send for a doctor in weather like this. "No doctor will make it through those roads tonight," Elinor said, kneeling beside the boy without hesitation, examining his arm with careful, practiced hands. Her own mother had taught her a great deal about tending to injuries, back when doctors were a luxury the family could no longer easily afford. "It isn't broken." I've seen breaks before, and this isn't one. It's badly bruised, and perhaps the wrist is sprained, but nothing worse than that." "Are you certain, miss?" one of the older maids asked, her voice tight with worry. "As certain as I can be without a doctor to confirm it," Alina said, and then, to the boy himself, she added gently, "You were very brave to stay out there as long as you did, making sure the horses were safe. That was well done, even if it cost you a sore arm for your trouble." Peter managed a small, watery smile at that, the first sign of ease returning to his face, and Alina set about finding clean linen to bind the injury properly, instructing one of the younger servants to fetch cool water and another to keep the boy warm and calm until the swelling had a chance to settle. She did not notice the Duke standing in the kitchen doorway until she had finished tying off the last of the binding. Alexander had come down to check on the household staff himself, a habit his grandmother often teased him for, saying no other duke in England concerned himself so directly with the comfort of his servants. He had expected to find the kitchen in some state of minor chaos, and he had expected to be the one steadying it. Instead, he found Alina Hartley kneeling on the stone floor in her fine gown, her sleeves pushed back, calmly directing a small operation of care and comfort as though she had done this 100 times before, which, he would later learn, she very nearly had. "Your Grace," one of the maids said, startled, rising quickly and pulling the others up with her, but Alexander waved a hand for them to continue their work. "Please," he said, "don't let me interrupt." Alina glanced up at him, and for a brief moment something like embarrassment crossed her face, as though she had been caught doing something improper rather than something kind. But it passed quickly, replaced by the same steady calm she had shown all evening. "The boy will be fine," she said simply. "He needs rest and warmth and someone to check on his arm again in the morning, but there's no need for alarm." "You seem to know a great deal about this sort of thing," Alexander said, moving closer, his eyes taking in the careful binding on Peter's arm, the clean efficiency of it. "My family has not always had the money for doctors," Alina said, without shame or apology, simply stating a fact. "One learns to manage." Alexander said nothing more in that moment, but something in his chest had shifted again, more forcefully this time, and he found himself lingering in the kitchen far longer than any duke had reason to, watching the quiet way she moved among the frightened staff, offering steady words and gentle reassurance to people who had no title, no fortune, and no reason to expect kindness from a guest of her standing. When the immediate crisis had passed, and Peter had been settled into a chair near the fire with a cup of warm broth pressed into his good hand, Alina rose and smoothed down her skirts, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must appear, her hair coming loose from its pins, her sleeves still pushed up past her wrists. "I should return to the others," she said, "before Lady Priscilla decides I've been swallowed by the storm." "Allow me to escort you," Alexander said, and it was not a request so much as a decision already made, and Alina, sensing no good reason to refuse, allowed him to walk beside her back through the dark corridors toward the drawing room. They did not speak much on that short walk, but the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that settles between two people who have just witnessed something true about each other, something that cannot easily be put into words and does not need to be. When they reached the drawing room, the noise and light spilled out to meet them, and the moment dissolved back into the ordinary business of the evening. But Alina carried the memory of it with her for the rest of the night. Tucked away like a small, private treasure she was not yet ready to examine too closely. The storm raged on outside, growing worse rather than better as the hours passed, and by the time midnight arrived, it became clear to everyone in the house that no one would be traveling anywhere until morning at the very earliest. Rooms were hastily prepared for those guests who had not originally planned to stay the night, and the household staff moved through the halls with candles cupped carefully against the drafts, doing their best to make the unexpected arrangement as comfortable as possible. Alina was given a small guest room near the east wing, modest compared to the grander chambers assigned to some of the other young women, though she did not mind this in the slightest. She had never cared for grandness the way some people did, and a small room with a warm bed and a working lock on the door was more comfort than she had expected from the evening at all. She could not sleep, however, not with the wind still howling against the windows and her thoughts still turning over the events of the night. She sat by the small fireplace in her room, wrapped in a blanket she had found folded at the foot of the bed, and watched the flames dance while the storm continued its assault on the old stone walls of Ashcombe Hall. It was well past midnight when she decided that sleep was not coming, and that perhaps a book from the library might help settle her restless mind. She had noticed the library earlier that day during the garden walk, its tall windows visible from the south lawn, and she remembered the housekeeper mentioning that guests were welcome to browse its shelves at any hour. She lit a small candle from the dying embers of her fire, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and made her way quietly through the darkened corridors, careful not to wake any of the other guests who had, by this hour, mostly retired to their rooms. The library, when she found it, was empty and cold, the fire long since burned down to almost nothing, but the shelves rose up around her in comforting rows, filled with the leather spines of books that had clearly been collected and cherished across many generations. She moved slowly along the shelves, tilting her candle to read titles, and had just pulled down a worn volume of poetry when a voice from the far corner of the room made her nearly drop the candle in surprise. "I did not expect company tonight." Elinor turned quickly to find the Duke seated in a large leather chair near the cold fireplace, a book open on his lap, though from the stillness of his posture, she suspected he had not been reading it for some time. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said quickly. "I couldn't sleep and I thought a book might help. I didn't mean to disturb you." "You haven't disturbed me," Alexander said, setting his own book aside and rising from the chair. "I find I can't sleep either. It seems we share that particular affliction tonight." He gestured toward the empty chair across from his own, and Elinor hesitated only a moment before accepting the unspoken invitation, settling into the seat and setting her candle on the small table between them, along with the book of poetry she had chosen almost at random. "You handled things very well tonight," Alexander said, once she had settled. "With the boy and with Miss Ashwick's gown before that, most guests in your position would have called for a servant and gone back to their evening." "Most guests in my position have not spent their childhoods learning to manage without servants close at hand," Elinor said, a small, wry smile touching her lips. "It isn't kindness so much as habit, Your Grace. When something is broken or hurt, someone has to fix it, and there is rarely time to wait for someone grander to arrive and do it instead." "Call me Alexander," he said, somewhat abruptly, surprising even himself with the offer. "At least tonight. I find I have grown tired of being addressed like a title rather than a person, and you are the first guest all week who has spoken to me as though I were simply a man." Elinor studied him for a long moment in the dim candlelight, weighing the offer and the strange, unguarded honesty behind it. "Alexander, then," she said finally, "and you may call me Elinor if it pleases you." "It does," he said, and something in his voice, quiet and sincere, told her that he meant it more than the simple words suggested. What followed was a conversation, unlike any Elinor had shared with another person in a very long time, one that stretched on for hours as the storm continued to rage outside, and the candle slowly burned itself down to a small stub of wax. They spoke of things neither of them had planned to share, of grief and expectation, of the strange, isolating weight of being valued for a name or a fortune rather than for the person underneath. And somewhere in the depths of that long night, in a cold library lit by a single failing candle, Alexander Whitmore began to feel something he had believed himself incapable of feeling ever again. "Tell me about her," Elinor said quietly, after a long stretch of comfortable silence had settled between them. "The one who came before. I have heard whispers, of course, but whispers rarely tell the truth of anything." Alexander was quiet for a moment, turning his empty teacup slowly in his hands, as though deciding how much of the old wound he was willing to show to someone he had known for less than a day. "Her name was Charlotte Vance," he said finally. "We were engaged for nearly a year, Everyone said it was a good match, sensible, well-suited, exactly the sort of arrangement two families like ours were meant to make. I believed, foolishly, that it might grow into something more than sensible over time. What happened? She left 3 weeks before the wedding, Alexander said, his voice carefully flat, the way a man speaks when he has told a story so many times that the pain has been worn smooth, like a stone rubbed by years of water. For another man, one with fewer responsibilities and considerably more charm than I apparently possessed, she sent a letter. I did not even have the chance to ask her why in person. Elinor did not offer the easy sympathy he had likely heard 100 times before. She simply sat with the weight of what he had shared, letting it settle in the quiet room before she spoke again. That must have made it very hard to trust anyone who came after her, she said. It did, Alexander admitted. Every young woman my grandmother has paraded through this house since then has seemed to me like another version of the same performance. Smiles calculated to please, conversation designed to flatter. I stopped believing that any of it was real because the one time I allowed myself to believe it, it cost me a great deal more than a broken engagement. And now, Elinor asked, though she was not entirely certain what answer she was hoping for. Alexander looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way that made her suddenly aware of how close their chairs had drawn together over the course of the long night, how the candlelight caught the loose strands of hair that had fallen from her pins hours ago. Now, he said slowly, I find myself sitting in a library at 3 in the morning, telling a woman I met only yesterday things I have never said aloud to anyone, and I cannot entirely explain why, except that it does not feel like a performance at all. Elinor felt her heart quicken at that, though she was careful not to let it show on her face. She had come to Ashcombe Hall expecting nothing, prepared for nothing, and she was wise enough to know that a single night of honest conversation, however moving, did not make promises that a duke's family would ever allow him to keep. She had seen enough of the world to understand the difference between a man's private feelings and the choices his position ultimately forced upon him. You should be careful, Alexander, she said gently. Saying things like that to a woman with no fortune and no great name to offer you. Your grandmother has other plans for you, I imagine, and they likely do not include a baron's daughter whose family cannot even afford to keep its own gardens. My grandmother wants me married, Alexander said. She has never once told me who that marriage must be with. That particular requirement, I confess, has always come from everyone else. Elinor smiled at that, a real smile, unguarded and warm, and for a moment the years of quiet worry that had settled over her features seemed to lift entirely, revealing something younger and more hopeful underneath. Tell me about your family, Alexander said, eager to keep the conversation flowing, unwilling yet to let the night end. Truly. Not the version fit for a drawing room. So Elinor told him. She told him about her mother, who had died when Elinor was only 12, leaving behind a household of grief that her father had never quite managed to fill. She told him about the slow decline of the family's fortune, a series of bad investments made by an uncle who had since fled to the continent rather than face the debts he had created, and the quiet, constant work of keeping up appearances for a family that could barely afford its own coal in winter. She told him about learning to mend clothing instead of buying new gowns, about teaching herself to bind wounds and brew remedies from the herb garden, because doctors had become an expense they could rarely justify, about the strange, private pride she took in managing so much with so little, even as she watched her father grow smaller and more defeated with each passing year. You make it sound almost like an adventure, Alexander said when she had finished, though there was no mockery in his tone, only a kind of quiet wonder. It felt like survival more than adventure most days, Elinor admitted. But I have found over the years that there is a strange freedom in having very little left to lose. I do not fear scandal the way some women do, because scandal cannot take from me what I do not already have. I do not fear disappointing people with grand expectations, because no one has ever expected very much of me at all. I expect a great deal of you, Alexander said quietly, and the words hung in the air between them, weighted with a meaning neither of them was quite ready to name aloud. The candle guttered low, casting long, flickering shadows across the shelves of books, and outside the storm had begun, at last, to soften into a steady, gentler rain, the worst of the wind finally spent against the old stone walls. Neither of them moved to end the conversation, though both knew that morning would come soon enough, and with it, the return of every expectation and obligation that the night had allowed them briefly to forget. "May I ask you something honest?" Elinor said after a long pause. "Always. Why does your grandmother's list include so many names, and yet you seem to have shown interest in none of them until tonight?" Alexander considered the question carefully before answering. "Because until tonight, every conversation I have had in this house has felt like an audition, everyone performing the role they believe I want to see. You are the first person who has simply been yourself in my presence, without seeming to calculate what that honesty might cost or earn you." "Perhaps I am simply a poor performer," Elinor said, though her tone carried more warmth than doubt. "Perhaps," Alexander agreed, a small smile finally breaking through his usual careful reserve. "You are the only honest person left in England, and I have been fortunate enough to find you." They talked until the candle finally burned itself out entirely, plunging the library into a soft gray darkness that matched the first faint hints of dawn creeping through the tall windows. When Elinor finally rose to return to her room, her legs stiff from hours spent curled in the same chair, Alexander walked her to the library door, and there, in the quiet hush of early morning, he took her hand gently in his own. "Thank you," he said simply, "for tonight." "Thank you for trusting me with it," Elinor replied. And then, gently withdrawing her hand, she slipped away down the darkened corridor, leaving Alexander standing alone in the doorway of the library, watching her go with an expression that would have startled anyone who had known him only as the cold, dutiful Duke of Ashcombe. He did not sleep at all that night, though he did not mind the loss of rest in the slightest. For the first time in years, his mind was occupied not with account books or tenant disputes or the weight of a title he had never asked to carry, but with the memory of a woman's steady voice, the sound of honest laughter shared in a cold library, and a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest that he was almost afraid to name. Elinor, for her part, lay awake in her small guest room until the sun had fully risen, staring at the ceiling and trying, without much success, to convince herself that the night had meant nothing more than two lonely people finding brief comfort in each other's company during a storm. She told herself this several times, with growing lack of conviction, and finally gave up the effort entirely, allowing herself, just for a moment, to imagine what it might feel like if the warmth she had felt in that library was something real, something that might survive the harsh light of morning and the return of everyone else's expectations. She did not yet know how quickly those expectations would arrive, or how sharply they would try to cut the fragile new feeling away before it had any chance to grow. Morning arrived at Ashcombe Hall with a washed, pale sky, and the sound of servants clearing fallen branches from the drive. The roads, though still muddy, were passable again, and word quickly spread among the guests that carriages would be arranged for anyone wishing to return home that afternoon. Most of the young women greeted this news with visible relief, eager to return to proper baths and fresh gowns, and the strange, unplanned intimacy of the night before was quickly buried beneath a flurry of packing and polite farewells. Elinor came down to breakfast later than most, having finally fallen into a shallow sleep just as dawn broke, and found the dining room already half full of guests picking at plates of eggs and cold meat, while discussing the previous night's storm as though it had been nothing more than an inconvenient delay to their travel plans. She took her seat quietly near the end of the table, aware of a strange, fluttering nervousness in her chest that she had never experienced before a simple breakfast. Alexander entered a short while later, and Elinor felt her pulse quicken despite her best efforts to appear composed. He greeted the table with his usual measured politeness, offering brief comments about the storm's damage to the eastern fields, and if anyone at the table noticed the slight, lingering glance he sent toward the far end of the table where Elinor sat, they did not remark upon it, though one person most certainly did notice, and filed the observation away for later use. Lady Priscilla Ashwick had not survived so many years of careful social maneuvering without developing a sharp eye for exactly this kind of small, telling detail. She had brought her own daughter, Charlotte, to Ashcombe Hall with very deliberate hopes, and she had spent the better part of the past 2 days quietly cultivating opportunities for Charlotte to be seen at her most charming and accomplished. The last thing she intended to allow was for some minor baron's daughter, with no fortune and no name worth mentioning, to slip in and disrupt those careful plans with nothing more than a quiet manner and a few well-timed acts of kindness. She said nothing at breakfast. She simply watched and waited and began quietly assembling the pieces of a plan. The Duchess Margaret, seated at the head of the table despite her failing health, watched the entire breakfast with far sharper eyes than her frail appearance suggested. She had noticed, too, the way her grandson's gaze kept drifting toward the quiet young woman at the far end of the table, and unlike Lady Priscilla, she found the observation deeply encouraging rather than threatening. After breakfast, while the guests began preparing for their departures, the Duchess sent word requesting that Elinor join her privately in the small sitting room she kept for herself on the ground floor, a request that startled Elinor considerably, given that she had exchanged barely a dozen words with the old woman since her arrival. The sitting room was warm and cluttered with the small treasures of a long life, portraits and porcelain figures and shelves of books that had clearly been read and reread many times over. The Duchess sat near the window in a chair positioned to catch the morning light, a shawl draped over her thin shoulders despite the mild weather, and she gestured for Elinor to sit in the chair opposite her own. "You handled last night's chaos with a great deal more grace than most of the young women in this house would have managed," the Duchess said, without preamble. "I heard about the footman's spilled wine, and the stable boy's arm from no fewer than 4 different servants this morning, all of them eager to sing your praises." "I only did what needed doing," Elinor said, unsure quite where this conversation was headed and wary of saying too much. "That is precisely my point, my dear," the Duchess said, a small, knowing smile touching her lined face. "Most people in your position would have done nothing at all and felt no shame in the doing of nothing. You did not hesitate. That tells me a great deal about your character, more than any list of accomplishments or any fine gown ever could." Elinor felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain how to respond to such direct praise from a woman she had expected to view her, at best, with polite indifference. "I understand your family has faced some difficulties," the Duchess continued, her tone gentler now, carrying no trace of judgment. "I knew your mother many years ago before her marriage. She was a kind woman and clever, though the world did not always reward her cleverness the way it should have. I see a great deal of her in you." "You knew my mother?" Elinor asked, surprised. "We attended the same school for young ladies, briefly, before our paths diverged," the Duchess said. "I have thought of her often over the years, wondering how her life turned out. I am sorry to hear that fortune was not kind to your family in the years since." "We manage," Elinor said, echoing the same phrase she had used with Alexander the night before, and the Duchess's smile widened slightly, as though she recognized the family resemblance in more than just appearance. "I did not invite you to Ashcombe Hall merely to fill out a guest list, whatever your father may have assumed," the Duchess said, her voice growing more serious. "I invited you because something told me my grandson needed to meet someone entirely unlike every other candidate on that list, someone who would not perform for him, or flatter him, or see only the title when they looked at his face. I believe I was right to trust that instinct." Elinor did not know how to respond to this, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear that felt almost too large for her chest to contain. "Your Grace, I do not wish to presume anything about your grandson's intentions, or mine. Last night was simply a conversation, nothing more." "Was it?" the Duchess asked, one eyebrow arching with gentle amusement. "Forgive an old woman her curiosity, but my grandson has not looked at another living soul the way he looked at you across that breakfast table in more years than I care to count. I would be a poor grandmother, indeed, if I did not notice such a thing, and an even poorer one if I did not encourage it." Before Alina could formulate any kind of reply, a soft knock interrupted them, and a servant entered to inform the Duchess that several guests were preparing to depart and wished to offer their farewells before leaving. The Duchess sighed, the brief moment of private conversation drawing to a close, but before Alina rose to leave, the old woman reached out and took her hand with surprising strength. "Whatever happens in the days ahead," the Duchess said quietly, "know that you have already earned more respect in this house in a single evening than most of the guests who have passed through these halls in years. Do not let anyone convince you that your worth is measured only in fortune or family name. It never has been, not truly, and it never will be." Alina left the sitting room with her thoughts in complete disarray, the Duchess's words echoing alongside the memory of the long night in the library, and she barely noticed Lady Priscilla watching her from across the entrance hall with an expression of calculating displeasure as she made her way toward the stairs. The carriages began departing throughout the early afternoon, families bidding their farewells with the particular blend of relief and disappointment that comes from an unexpected overnight stay finally coming to an end. Alina's own carriage was among the last to be readied, her father having sent word that he would send for her once the roads near their own estate had been properly cleared. She found herself, quite by accident, alone near the stables while waiting for word of her carriage, checking on young Peter's arm one final time before her departure. The boy's swelling had gone down considerably overnight, and he greeted her with a shy, grateful smile that warmed something deep in her chest. "You have a gift for this kind of thing, miss," he said, as she unwrapped and re-examined the binding on his wrist. "My mother always said a good healer is worth more than a dozen doctors who only know their books and none of their patients." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Alina said, retying the binding with practiced care. It was there in the quiet stable yard that Alexander found her, having sought her out deliberately once he learned her carriage had not yet departed. He approached slowly, watching her tend to the stable boy's injury with the same quiet competence she had shown the night before, and waited patiently until she had finished before speaking. "Your carriage will not arrive until later this afternoon, I understand," he said. Once Peter had scampered off toward the stables, his arm considerably improved. "My father is arranging for it now," Alina said, straightening and brushing a bit of straw from her skirts, suddenly self-conscious in his presence in a way she had not felt during the honest darkness of the library the night before. In the full light of day, with the memory of everything shared between them so fresh, she found herself unsure how to behave. "I wondered if you might walk with me while you wait," Alexander said. "There is a path along the eastern edge of the property I think you might enjoy. It leads to an old chapel, mostly ruined now, but rather beautiful in its way." Alina hesitated only briefly before agreeing, and the two of them set off along a narrow path that wound away from the main house, through a stretch of woodland still dripping from the previous night's storm, the air fresh and clean and smelling of wet earth and new growth. They spoke at first of small things, the damage the storm had caused to the estate's fields, the strange beauty of a landscape freshly washed by rain, but gradually the conversation deepened again, returning to the honest, unguarded tone they had found together in the library. Alexander told her more about his responsibilities as Duke, the weight of managing an estate that supported hundreds of families, the loneliness of decisions that fell entirely on his own shoulders. Alina listened, and offered her own thoughts freely, unafraid to disagree with him when she believed he was wrong, a quality he found he valued more with each passing moment. When they reached the old chapel, its stone walls crumbling and covered in ivy, sunlight streaming through gaps where a roof had once stood, Alexander stopped and turned to face her directly. "Alina," he said, "I know we have known each other only a single day, and I know how strange, how impossible this must seem given everything that surrounds us. But I find I cannot simply let you return home and disappear back into a list of names my grandmother has assembled, as though last night meant nothing at all." "Alexander," Alina said gently, though her heart was pounding fiercely in her chest, Your family expects you to marry someone suitable. A title, a fortune, connections that can benefit the estate. I have none of those things to offer you. Whatever I felt last night, whatever you felt, it cannot change the reality of what your position requires. I have spent years allowing my position to dictate every choice I make, Alexander said, his voice quiet but firm. I do not intend to let it dictate this one, at least not without a fight. Before Elinor could respond, the sound of hooves on the path behind them announced the arrival of a servant, breathless from running, informing Elinor that her carriage had finally arrived and was waiting at the front of the house. The moment broke, as moments so often do, interrupted by the ordinary business of the world continuing on around them, and Elinor found herself walking back toward the house beside Alexander in a silence heavier and more complicated than the one that had settled over them in the library the night before. At the carriage, as her trunk was loaded and her father's coachman waited patiently at the reins, Alexander took her hand one final time, holding it perhaps a moment longer than was strictly proper. "This is not goodbye," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "I intend to see you again, Elinor Hartley, whatever my grandmother's list may say about the matter." Elinor did not trust herself to speak, offering only a small, uncertain smile before climbing into the carriage and watching Ashcombe Hall grow smaller and smaller through the small rear window as the carriage rolled away down the muddy drive. She did not yet know that behind her, in the quiet halls of Ashcombe, Lady Priscilla had already begun quietly asking pointed questions about the Hartley family's finances to anyone in the household willing to answer them, laying the first careful stones of a plan designed to ensure that Elinor Hartley never received another invitation to Ashcombe Hall again. The days following Elinor's departure from Ashcombe Hall passed slowly for Alexander, filled with the usual demands of managing his estate, yet colored throughout by a persistent, quiet longing he could not quite shake. He found himself distracted during meetings with his estate manager, his thoughts drifting toward a cold library and a woman's steady voice, and more than once he caught himself staring out toward the eastern edge of his land, in the direction of the Hartley estate, as though he might catch some glimpse of her from that distance alone. His grandmother noticed his distraction immediately, and unlike the concern she might have shown for any other cause, she seemed rather pleased by it. "You have not smiled this much in years, and you have barely spoken 2 words to me all week," the Duchess observed one afternoon, as Alexander sat across from her in her sitting room, ostensibly reviewing household accounts but clearly thinking of something else entirely. "I assume I have Miss Hartley to thank for both conditions." "Grandmother," Alexander said, setting aside the ledger with a small, embarrassed smile, "I do not know what has come over me. It has been only a handful of days, and yet I find myself thinking of her constantly." "That, my dear boy, is precisely how love is meant to feel," the Duchess said, her tired eyes bright with genuine happiness. "You spent so many years convincing yourself that Charlotte Vance's betrayal meant love itself was a foolish indulgence, not worth the risk of a second attempt. I am glad to see you finally proven wrong." "I have not asked her anything yet," Alexander said. "I do not even know if she feels the same way, or if she would even consider such a match, given everything that separates our families." "Then stop wasting time sitting in this room with an old woman and her account books, and go find out," the Duchess said, with the particular bluntness that only the very old or the very confident allow themselves to use. Alexander took her advice more seriously than she perhaps expected, and within the week, he had arranged to visit the Hartley estate under the guise of a courtesy call, ostensibly to discuss matters of shared boundary lines between their 2 properties, though everyone involved, including Baron Hartley himself, understood the visit's true purpose within moments of Alexander's arrival. Baron Hartley, delighted beyond measure at the prospect of a duke taking interest in his daughter, could barely contain his enthusiasm as he welcomed Alexander into the modest but well-kept sitting room of the Hartley home. Elinor, summoned from the garden where she had been working alongside the single remaining gardener the family still employed, arrived with dirt still faintly visible on her hands, and a look of startled surprise on her face at finding the Duke of Ashcombe seated in her family's humble parlor. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a hasty curtsy, acutely aware of her plain work dress and the state of her hands, so different from the fine gown she had worn during their previous meetings. "I was not expecting visitors." "Forgive the intrusion," Alexander said, rising from his seat, his eyes taking in every small detail of her appearance with an admiration he made no effort to hide. "I found myself unable to stay away any longer." Baron Hartley, sensing perhaps that his presence was no longer required, excused himself with a rather transparent excuse about checking on the horses, leaving Alina and Alexander alone together in the small sitting room, sunlight streaming through the modest windows and illuminating the worn but carefully maintained furniture that spoke of a family determined to preserve its dignity despite reduced circumstances. "I have thought of little else besides our conversation in the library since you left," Alexander admitted, once they were alone. "I know it must seem impulsive, arriving here so soon, but I did not wish to give my grandmother's other candidates any further opportunity to occupy my attention before I had the chance to properly pursue what I felt that night." "Alexander," Alina said, using his given name without the title for the first time since her departure, "I have thought of it too, more than I probably should. But I worry that what we shared was born from the strangeness of the storm itself, from candlelight and rain, and the particular honesty that comes when the ordinary rules of a situation are temporarily suspended. I fear that in the light of day, surrounded by everything that separates our positions, we may find that the feeling does not survive. I have tested that fear against every day that has passed since you left," Alexander said, "and I find the feeling has only grown stronger, not weaker. I did not come here today on impulse, Alina. I came here because I have spent a full week convincing myself that this is the most sensible decision I have made in years, however unconventional it may appear to everyone else." Alina felt her resolve, carefully constructed over the previous week to protect herself from exactly this kind of hope, begin to waver dangerously. "Your grandmother's list still exists," she said, though with less conviction than she intended. "There are still 11 other names on it, women with fortunes and connections that could genuinely benefit your family and your estate. What could I possibly offer that they cannot?" "Honesty," Alexander said simply. "Kindness that asks for nothing in return, a willingness to see me as a man rather than a title. I have spent years surrounded by people calculating what they might gain from my attention, and you are the first person in longer than I can remember who has never once looked at me that way." They spoke for the better part of 2 hours that afternoon, walking eventually through the modest but carefully tended garden Alina had worked so hard to maintain despite her family's reduced circumstances. And by the time Alexander finally took his leave, both of them understood, without needing to speak the words aloud, that something real and lasting had taken root between them, however uncertain the path ahead might prove to be. Word of the Duke's visit to the Hartley estate spread quickly through the surrounding countryside, as such news inevitably does, and it did not take long for that word to reach the ears of Lady Priscilla Ashwick, who received it with considerably less enthusiasm than the general public. Lady Priscilla had spent the intervening days since the storm carefully cultivating her own network of information, and she had already learned a great deal about the true state of the Hartley family's finances, details far more dire than the polite fiction the Baron maintained in public society. She learned of debts owed to several merchants in the nearest town, of a mortgage on the family estate that had fallen dangerously behind, and of an uncle whose disgraceful flight to the continent had left the family's reputation nearly as damaged as its finances. None of this information was, strictly speaking, false, but Lady Priscilla possessed a particular talent for shaping true facts into weapons far sharper than any outright lie could ever be. She began her campaign carefully, dropping small comments into conversations at social gatherings throughout the county, comments carefully worded to sound like concerned observations rather than deliberate attacks. She spoke of her worry that certain families might see a duke's attention as a convenient solution to financial troubles, rather than a genuine match of hearts. She wondered aloud, in the hearing of several prominent families, whether the Hartley girl's sudden closeness to the Duke had perhaps been engineered rather than accidental, whether a young woman raised to manage a household on almost nothing might not be particularly skilled at managing a wealthy man's affections toward her own family's benefit. The rumors spread with the particular speed that only truly damaging gossip seems to possess, twisting and growing with each retelling, until the story that eventually reached Aliner's own ears, relayed with obvious discomfort by a sympathetic neighbor, bore only a passing resemblance to the truth of what had actually happened between her and Alexander. By the time the whispers reached her, they had transformed into something ugly and calculated, suggestions that Aliner had deliberately orchestrated the entire episode with the stable boy's injury, that she had somehow manufactured the storm-bound circumstances to trap the Duke's attention, that her family's desperate financial situation had made her willing to use any means necessary to secure a wealthy marriage regardless of genuine feeling. Aliner received this news with a cold, sinking horror that settled deep in her stomach. She had spent her entire life protecting her family's dignity despite its reduced circumstances, working hard to ensure that no one could ever accuse her of the kind of desperate, calculating behavior that poverty sometimes drove people toward. And now, at the exact moment when something genuinely good and honest had finally found its way into her life, she found herself accused of the very thing she had always taken the greatest pains to avoid. Worse still, she began to wonder, in the quiet, doubting hours of the night, whether there might be some small kernel of truth buried within the ugly rumors. Had some part of her, however unconsciously, recognized the advantage of the Duke's attention and allowed herself to encourage it more than pure honesty would have permitted? She turned the question over and over in her mind until she could no longer trust her own memory of that night in the library, uncertain now whether the connection they had shared had been as pure and mutual as she had believed, or whether her own desperate circumstances had colored her actions in ways she had failed to recognize in herself. This doubt, more than the rumors themselves, proved to be Lady Priscilla's most effective weapon, for it required no further effort on her part to spread. Once planted, it grew entirely on its own within Aliner's mind, poisoning the memory of every genuine moment shared between herself and Alexander, until she could no longer look back on that storm-bound night without a creeping sense of shame and uncertainty. Her father, when he learned of the rumors circulating through the county, reacted with a mixture of outrage and fear that did little to ease Aliner's growing distress. He worried, with good reason, that the scandal might damage what little remained of the family's reputation, potentially closing doors that had taken years of careful effort to keep even partially open. He urged Aliner to write to Alexander immediately, to clarify her position, to reassure him that the rumors held no truth, but Aliner found herself paralyzed by a strange, cruel combination of pride and shame that made such a letter feel impossible to compose. How could she explain herself without sounding exactly like the calculating, desperate woman the rumors accused her of being? Any defense she offered would only seem to confirm that she had something to defend against in the first place, and the very act of protesting her innocence too loudly might convince Alexander, or worse, convince his family, that the accusations held some measure of truth after all. In the end, rather than writing the letter her father urged her to write, Aliner did something far more damaging to her own hopes. She wrote instead a brief, formal note to Alexander, thanking him for his kindness during her stay at Ashcombe Hall, and gently suggesting that given the demands of his position and the many other candidates still under consideration, it would perhaps be best for both of them if their acquaintance did not continue any further. She sealed the letter before she could allow herself to reconsider its contents, and sent it off with the family's coachman before her father even learned what she had decided to do, believing, in her moment of doubt and wounded pride, that she was protecting Alexander from a scandal that her family's circumstances had brought upon him, and protecting herself from ever having to discover whether his affection might waver once faced with the full ugly weight of the rumors now circulating so freely through the county. She did not yet understand how deeply that single letter would wound the man who had, for the first time in years, allowed himself to hope for something real. Alexander read Aliner's letter 3 times before he allowed himself to believe what it actually said. And even then, disbelief settled over him like a heavy fog that refused to lift. He had expected many things in the days following his visit to the Hartley estate, further conversations, perhaps even the beginnings of a formal courtship. But he had not expected this quiet, formal withdrawal, so different in tone from the honest, unguarded woman he had come to know during that long night in the library. He sat with the letter for a long time in his study, reading and rereading the careful, distant phrasing, searching for some hidden meaning beneath the polite words, some clue as to what might have changed so dramatically in the days since his visit. He could find none, and the not knowing proved almost harder to bear than the rejection itself. His grandmother found him there hours later, still seated at his desk with the letter spread before him, his expression more troubled than she had seen it in years. "What has happened?" the Duchess asked, settling into the chair across from him with obvious concern. Alexander handed her the letter without a word, and watched her expression shift from confusion to something sharper, more suspicious, as she read through its careful, distant phrasing. "This does not sound like the young woman I spoke with in my sitting room," the Duchess said, setting the letter down with a frown. "That girl looked at you the way a woman looks at someone she cannot quite believe she is allowed to hope for. This letter sounds like someone who has been frightened into retreat." "Frightened by what?" Alexander asked. "I gave her no reason for fear. I offered her nothing but honesty and genuine affection." "Perhaps the fear did not come from you," the Duchess said thoughtfully, and something in her tone suggested a suspicion already beginning to form in her sharp, experienced mind. It did not take long for the Duchess, with her extensive network of contacts throughout county society, to uncover the source of the rumors that had begun circulating so aggressively in the days since Alexander's visit to the Hartley estate. A quiet word to her lady's maid, a careful conversation with a longtime friend who moved in the same social circles as Lady Priscilla, and within 2 days, the Duchess had assembled enough information to understand exactly what had happened, and precisely who bore responsibility for it. She brought this information to Alexander with the same directness she brought to every matter of importance. "Lady Priscilla Ashwick has been busy," the Duchess said, settling into her usual chair in Alexander's study with the air of a woman about to deliver news she found equal parts infuriating and entirely unsurprising. "It seems her daughter's failure to catch your attention has left her rather bitter, and she has spent the past week ensuring that a certain baron's daughter suffers for the crime of succeeding where her own child did not." Alexander listened with growing anger as his grandmother laid out the details of the rumors Lady Priscilla had spread, the accusations of calculated manipulation, the suggestions that Aliner had somehow engineered the entire storm-bound encounter for her family's financial benefit. The more he heard, the more he understood the true source of Aliner's sudden, painful withdrawal, and the more furious he became, not at Aliner for believing the rumors might damage him, but at the entire cruel system of gossip and calculation that had made her believe withdrawal was the only honorable path available to her. "This is precisely the sort of poison I have spent years trying to avoid," Alexander said, rising from his desk and pacing the length of his study with barely contained frustration. "Every candidate on your original list performs a role, calculates an advantage, and when I finally found someone who did neither of those things, someone whose only fault was genuine kindness and honest circumstance, this is how the world repays her for it." "Then do something about it," the Duchess said simply. "You are the Duke of Ashcombe. You hold more power in this county than nearly anyone else alive, and yet you sit here pacing your study as though you were as powerless as the poor girl these rumors have wounded." Meanwhile, in the days that followed her letter, Aliner found herself continuing with the demands of her ordinary life, with an ache in her chest that refused to fade. She threw herself into managing the household accounts alongside her father, tending to the garden that had become her one reliable source of comfort, and doing everything possible to avoid thinking about the choice she had made, though thoughts of Alexander crept into her mind at every quiet moment regardless of her efforts to suppress them. Her father, aware of the sacrifice his daughter had made, watched her with a mixture of guilt and sorrow that he could not quite express in words. He understood, better than anyone, the particular cruelty of a world that punished honest people for circumstances entirely beyond their control, having spent years watching his own family's fortunes decline through no true fault of their own, and he hated seeing his daughter suffer the same kind of unjust punishment for nothing more than the crime of being noticed by a man too far above her station. "You should not have sent that letter," he told her one evening, as they sat together near the small fire in their modest sitting room, the only illumination remaining in a house that had learned to economize on candles years ago. "Whatever the rumors say, whatever Lady Priscilla and her allies whisper behind their fans, you did nothing wrong, Eleanor. You have never done anything wrong in your entire life, and I will not sit here and watch you punish yourself for other people's cruelty." "It was not only about the rumors, Papa," Eleanor admitted quietly. "I began to doubt myself. I wondered whether some part of me had wanted his attention more than I realized, whether I had let that wanting shape my actions without fully understanding what I was doing." "And do you truly believe that now, looking back with clearer eyes?" her father asked gently. Eleanor considered the question seriously, turning her memory back to that long night in the library, to the honest fear and grief Alexander had shared with her, to the genuine, unguarded warmth that had passed between them without calculation on either side. "No," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not believe that at all. I believe I felt something real that night, something I have never felt before, and I let fear and cruel gossip convince me to throw it away before I ever gave it a fair chance to prove itself." "Then perhaps," her father said carefully, "the mistake can still be corrected if you find the courage to try." But pride, Eleanor discovered in the days that followed, proved a far more stubborn obstacle than fear alone had been. Having already sent the letter, having already suggested that continuing their acquaintance would be unwise, she could not imagine how she might reverse herself without appearing even more calculating and desperate than the rumors had already painted her to be. Better, she told herself repeatedly, to let the matter rest, to allow Alexander to move forward with one of the many other candidates still under his grandmother's consideration, and to preserve whatever small dignity remained to her family, rather than risk further humiliation by appearing to chase after a man who had, perhaps, already begun to forget her. She did not know that Alexander had, in fact, done exactly the opposite, spending every free moment since receiving her letter making quiet inquiries of his own, determined to uncover the truth behind her sudden withdrawal before he allowed himself to accept it as final. It was through one of these inquiries, made discreetly through a mutual acquaintance who moved comfortably in both their social circles, that Alexander finally learned the full extent of what Eleanor had endured in the days since her return home, not only the vicious rumors themselves, but the genuine anguish and self-doubt they had inflicted upon a woman who had done absolutely nothing to deserve such treatment. Armed with this knowledge, and with his grandmother's fierce encouragement ringing in his ears, Alexander made a decision that would set in motion the final, most difficult chapter of the story still unfolding between himself and Eleanor Hartley, a decision that would require him to defy nearly every expectation placed upon a man of his position, and to risk, quite deliberately, the very inheritance his grandmother had made the entire courtship process necessary to secure in the first place. The final gathering of candidates took place 2 weeks later, arranged by the Duchess with the explicit purpose of allowing Alexander to make his formal choice of bride before the deadline set by his grandmother's own wishes finally arrived. All 11 remaining young women returned to Ashcombe Hall for the occasion, dressed in their finest gowns, each one keenly aware that this evening would likely determine the entire course of her future. Lady Priscilla arrived with her daughter Charlotte, radiating a confidence that had grown considerably since her successful campaign against Eleanor Hartley's reputation. Believing herself to have cleared the single most significant obstacle standing between her daughter and the ducal title, she so desperately coveted. She positioned Charlotte prominently near the center of the great hall, ensuring that the girl's carefully chosen gown and practiced smile would be among the first things Alexander noticed upon his entrance. Alexander entered the hall precisely on time, dressed with his usual careful attention to formality, and made his way through the assembled candidates with the same measured politeness he had shown throughout the entire process, offering brief words to each young woman in turn, while his grandmother watched from her seat near the fire with an expression that gave away nothing of what she knew was about to unfold. When he had completed his circuit of the room, greeting each candidate with proper courtesy, Alexander moved to the center of the hall and requested the attention of everyone present, his voice carrying easily through the suddenly quiet space. "I want to thank each of you for your patience throughout this process," he began, his gaze moving slowly across the assembled young women. "My grandmother's wish that I marry before the year's end has led to a great deal of consideration on my part, consideration I have not taken lightly, given the significance of the decision before me." The room held its collective breath, every young woman present certain that the next words out of his mouth would name her as the chosen bride, and Lady Priscilla, in particular, leaned forward with barely contained anticipation, certain that her careful campaign had finally paid its intended dividend. "After much consideration," Alexander continued, "I have decided that I cannot, in good conscience, choose a bride from among the candidates presented to me this evening." A ripple of shocked murmurs swept through the room, and Lady Priscilla's confident expression collapsed into visible confusion and alarm. "Your Grace," she said, rising quickly from her seat, unable to contain herself, "surely you do not mean to forfeit the entire estate over some momentary hesitation. Your grandmother's condition was quite clear, and the deadline approaches rapidly." "I understand the deadline perfectly well, Lady Priscilla," Alexander said, turning to face her directly, his tone carrying a steel she had not heard from him before. "And I have no intention of forfeiting anything. I simply do not intend to marry any of the 11 candidates presented on my grandmother's original list." "Then who, Your Grace, do you intend to marry?" Charlotte Ashwick asked, her voice small and uncertain, genuinely curious despite her mother's evident distress. Alexander turned toward the young woman with something almost like gentleness in his expression, aware that whatever disappointment she felt was not truly her own fault. "Miss Ashwick, you are a lovely and accomplished young woman, and I have no doubt you will make some fortunate man an excellent wife. But you are not the woman I intend to marry, and I believe, if you search your own heart honestly, you will find that this news brings you more relief than sorrow, given how little genuine affection has ever passed between us during this entire process." Charlotte, to her credit, offered a small, surprised smile in response, as though recognizing the truth of his words even amid the disappointment of the moment. "There is one candidate whose name was included on my grandmother's list who is not present in this room tonight," Alexander continued, addressing the entire assembled group once more. "A young woman whose kindness, honesty, and genuine character stood apart from every other person I have met during this entire difficult process. A young woman who, through no fault of her own, became the target of vicious and entirely false rumors, spread deliberately to protect the interests of another candidate whose own qualifications could not stand on their own merit." Lady Priscilla's face had gone quite pale by this point, and several of the other guests turned to look at her with dawning suspicion and disapproval. "I am speaking, of course, of Miss Eleanor Hartley," Alexander said, "who withdrew from this process not because her feelings had changed, but because cruel gossip convinced her that continuing our acquaintance would bring shame upon herself and her family. I intend to correct that terrible injustice, and I intend to do so immediately, whatever the cost to the arrangements my grandmother originally established." "Alexander," the Duchess said, rising slowly from her chair with the assistance of her cane, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence of the room, "I believe you have my full support in whatever course you now intend to pursue. I never once specified that my grandson's bride must come from a particular list, only that he find a marriage built on genuine affection before this family's title passes to someone unworthy of it. If Miss Hartley possesses the qualities you describe, then I can think of no more fitting choice, regardless of what any list may have originally suggested." The room erupted into a flurry of whispered conversation, and Lady Priscilla, recognizing the complete collapse of her carefully constructed plan, attempted one final desperate defense. "Your Grace, surely you cannot simply take the word of gossip and speculation regarding my own conduct without proper evidence," she said, her voice rising with barely controlled panic. "I have gathered a great deal of evidence over the past several days, Lady Priscilla," Alexander said calmly, "including several witnesses willing to confirm precisely where the rumors regarding Miss Hartley originated, and precisely who benefited from their spread. I would advise you to consider carefully whether you wish to continue defending your conduct in a room full of witnesses, or whether you would prefer to withdraw with what remaining dignity you can still preserve." Lady Priscilla, recognizing the trap that had closed around her, chose the wiser course of immediate silence, gathering her still confused daughter and departing the hall with as much composure as she could manage under the weight of so many judging eyes. The remaining candidates, whatever disappointment they felt at losing their own chance at the ducal title, seemed largely satisfied by the dramatic revelation of Lady Priscilla's scheming, several of them openly expressing sympathy for the absent Eleanor Hartley and admiration for Alexander's willingness to defy convention on her behalf. Alexander did not linger long after Lady Priscilla's departure, offering brief, gracious farewells to the remaining guests before retreating to his study with his grandmother, where the two of them began immediately planning the next, most crucial step of his unconventional courtship. "You cannot simply write her another letter," the Duchess advised, settling into her usual chair with obvious satisfaction at the evening's dramatic turn of events. "She has already convinced herself that written words carry too much risk of misinterpretation. If you truly wish to reach her, you must go to her directly, and you must be prepared to face whatever doubt or resistance her wounded pride has built up in the time since her withdrawal." "I intend to leave first thing tomorrow morning," Alexander said, already feeling a familiar restlessness building in his chest, the same urgent need to act that had driven him toward the stables and the injured boy on the night of the storm. "Good," the Duchess said, her tired eyes bright with genuine happiness at the prospect of finally seeing her grandson pursue something purely for love rather than duty. "Because a woman like Eleanor Hartley will not be won back with grand gestures or expensive gifts. She will be won back only by seeing, with her own eyes, that you value her honesty and her character enough to fight through every obstacle her pride and her fear have placed in your path." That night Alexander slept only briefly, his mind already turning over every word he intended to say once he finally stood before Eleanor again, determined that this time, no letter, no rumor, and no misunderstanding would be allowed to stand between them before he had the chance to speak his heart directly and completely. Alexander arrived at the Hartley estate the following morning without any warning, riding out alone rather than waiting for a proper carriage to be arranged, driven by an urgency he had not felt about anything in years. Baron Hartley, startled by the unannounced arrival of the Duke himself at such an early hour, met him at the front door with obvious confusion, quickly followed by cautious hope, once he understood the purpose behind the visit. "She is in the garden, Your Grace," the Baron said, gesturing toward the side of the house with a small, encouraging smile. "She spends most mornings there now, though I confess she has not seemed herself in recent weeks." Alexander found Eleanor kneeling in the same garden where he had first walked with her weeks earlier, her hands busy among the flowers, her expression distant and troubled in a way that struck him deeply the moment he saw it. She did not notice his approach at first, too absorbed in her work and her thoughts, and he took a moment simply to watch her, gathering his courage for the conversation ahead. "Eleanor," he said finally, and she startled visibly, rising quickly to her feet with dirt still clinging to her hands, her eyes wide with shock at finding him standing there unannounced. Alexander, she said, using his given name before she could stop herself, and then catching herself added more formally, Your Grace, I did not expect you. I know, he said, closing the distance between them slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back or ask him to leave, though she did neither. I have come because I refuse to let a letter, however carefully worded, be the final word between us. Alexander, please, Elinor said, her voice tight with a mixture of hope and fear she could not quite suppress. You must understand the position my family is in. The rumors, whatever their origin, have already caused a great deal of damage. I cannot ask you to risk your own reputation, your own inheritance on my account. I have already risked both, Alexander said. 2 nights ago, in front of every remaining candidate on my grandmother's list, I refused to choose a bride from among them. I told them all, in front of witnesses, that the woman I intend to marry is not on that list at all, and I exposed Lady Priscilla's role in spreading the very rumors that drove you to send me that letter. Elinor stared at him, stunned into silence, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he had just described. You did that publicly. Alexander, that could have ruined you. Your grandmother's condition, the inheritance, the entire estate. My grandmother stood beside me the entire time, Alexander said. She told the assembled guests that her only true condition was that I find a marriage built on genuine affection, not that I choose from any particular list of names. She believes, as I do, that you are exactly the kind of person this family and this estate deserves, whatever fortune or connections you may lack. But the rumors, Elinor said, still struggling against years of practiced caution and self-doubt. People will still whisper, still question my motives, still wonder whether I somehow engineered all of this for my family's benefit. Let them whisper, Alexander said, taking her dirt-stained hands in his own without any hesitation. I know the truth of who you are, Elinor. I have known it since the moment I watched you calm a frightened stable boy and comfort a young footman without a single thought for how the gesture might appear to anyone watching. I have known it through every honest word you shared with me in that library, through every moment of genuine kindness I have witnessed from you since. No rumor, however cruel or however widely spread, can change what I know to be true about your character. Tears gathered in Elinor's eyes, tears she had held back for weeks through sheer force of will, finally breaking free as the weight of everything she had sacrificed, and everything she had doubted finally began to lift. I was so afraid, she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. Afraid that what I felt that night was not real. Afraid that my family's desperate circumstances had somehow corrupted my own feelings without my realizing it. Afraid that I would bring nothing but scandal and hardship to a man who deserved so much better than what I could offer him. You brought me honesty, Alexander said gently, reaching up to brush away one of her tears with careful tenderness. You brought me the first genuine conversation I have had with another human being in years that did not involve some calculation of advantage or performance of expected behavior. You brought me back to life, Elinor, after years of believing myself incapable of feeling anything beyond duty and obligation. That is not nothing. That is everything I have been searching for without ever knowing how to name it. What about your family's expectations? Elinor asked, though the question now carried far less resistance than it had moments before. What about the estate, the tenants, the entire weight of responsibility that comes with your title? My family's expectations will be satisfied by seeing me finally happy, Alexander said. My tenants will benefit from a duchess who understands what it means to manage carefully with limited resources, who has spent her entire life learning exactly the kind of practical wisdom that running an estate actually requires. And as for the weight of responsibility, I find it considerably easier to carry when I imagine carrying it alongside someone I trust and love, rather than alone, or beside someone chosen purely for the sake of convenient arrangement. Elinor felt the last of her resistance finally crumble entirely, the doubt and fear that had governed her actions for weeks giving way at last to the simple, overwhelming truth of what she had known in her heart since that long night in the library. The truth she had been too afraid to fully trust until this moment. standing in her family's modest garden with the morning sun rising higher in the sky above them. "I love you," she said simply, the words emerging with a clarity and certainty that surprised even herself. "I have loved you, I think, since that very first night, though I did not allow myself to name the feeling until this moment. I was foolish to let fear and cruel gossip convince me to throw it away." "Then let us both be foolish together," Alexander said, a genuine, unguarded smile breaking across his face. "And let us never again allow anyone else's cruelty or calculation to come between us." He knelt then, right there among the flowers she had spent years tending with such careful devotion, and asked her, with complete sincerity, and without any of the careful, calculated language expected of a duke arranging a suitable marriage, whether she would consent to become his wife, not out of obligation or convenience, but out of genuine, mutual love freely chosen by both of them. Aliner's answer came without hesitation, and the small garden, witness to so many years of quiet struggle and careful survival, became instead the site of a joy so complete that even the old gardener, watching from a discreet distance, found himself wiping tears from his weathered cheeks at the sight of it. Baron Hartley, who had been watching the entire scene unfold from a window inside the house, could barely contain his own emotion, rushing outside to embrace his daughter and shake Alexander's hand, with a vigor that betrayed years of quiet worry finally giving way to overwhelming relief and happiness. The engagement was announced formally within the week, and though Lady Priscilla and a small number of others continued to whisper their doubts and objections in certain circles, the overwhelming response throughout the county proved to be one of genuine delight and admiration, particularly once the full truth of Lady Priscilla's scheming became more widely known and thoroughly discredited. The Duchess Margaret lived to see her grandson's wedding, held at Ashcombe Hall on a bright autumn morning, surrounded by family, friends, and tenants from across the estate who had come to know and respect Aliner during the months of preparation leading up to the ceremony. The old woman sat near the front of the small chapel, the same chapel where Alexander had first spoken so directly of his feelings weeks earlier, her weathered face glowing with a happiness that seemed to erase years from her appearance. "I told you," she whispered to Alexander, as he waited nervously for his bride to appear, "that an old woman's instincts are rarely wrong when it comes to matters of the heart." Aliner appeared at the entrance of the chapel a moment later, dressed simply but beautifully, her expression radiant with a joy that had nothing to do with the title she was about to receive and everything to do with the man waiting for her at the altar. As she walked slowly down the aisle, past faces both familiar and new, all of them smiling with genuine warmth, she felt none of the fear or doubt that had haunted her in the weeks following the storm, only a deep, settled certainty that she had finally found exactly where she belonged. Their marriage in the years that followed proved to be everything both of them had hoped for and more. Aliner brought to the role of Duchess a practical wisdom and genuine warmth that quickly won the affection of tenants and household staff alike, managing the estate's resources with the same careful, thoughtful attention she had once applied to her own family's much smaller circumstances. Alexander, freed at last from the cold, dutiful reserve that had governed him for so many years, became known throughout the county as a duke who genuinely cared for the well-being of every person under his care, a transformation that everyone who knew him attributed directly to the influence of his beloved wife. The stable boy, Peter, grew up under their care to become one of the most trusted managers on the entire estate, never forgetting the kindness shown to him by the young woman who had bound his injured arm on the night of the great storm. And though Lady Priscilla never fully recovered her former standing in county society, her daughter Charlotte eventually found genuine happiness with a kind gentleman from a neighboring estate, a match built on real affection rather than calculated ambition, proof that even the shadow of her mother's schemes could not prevent true happiness from finding its way to those who deserved it. Aliner never forgot the storm that had brought her and Alexander together, nor the painful weeks of doubt and separation that had nearly torn them apart before their story had truly begun. She kept, for the rest of her life, a small piece of candle wax from that long night in the library, a strange and simple keepsake that reminded her always of the honest conversation that had changed the entire course of her future, and of the courage it had ultimately taken for both of them to choose love over the safer, more expected paths their world had originally laid out before them. Years later, when their eldest daughter, a bright and curious girl named Grace, asked how her parents had first fallen in love, Alina would tell her the story of the great storm, of a spilled glass of wine and an injured stable boy, of a cold library lit only by a single candle, and of the honest conversation that had changed everything between two people who had once believed themselves too different, too separated by circumstance, to ever find happiness together. Grace listened to this story countless times throughout her childhood, and never once grew tired of hearing it, delighting each time in the image of her proud father kneeling among garden flowers to ask for her mother's hand. Alexander, for his part, never regretted the choice he had made that night in front of every remaining candidate on his grandmother's original list, though he often reflected, in quiet moments, on how close he had come to losing Alina entirely to the cruelty of gossip and the weight of her own wounded pride. He made it a point, throughout his years as Duke, to personally investigate any rumor or accusation brought before him regarding members of his household or his tenants, refusing to allow the kind of unchecked, malicious gossip that had nearly destroyed his own happiness to go unchallenged whenever he had the power to intervene. The Duchess Margaret passed peacefully 2 years after the wedding, having lived just long enough to hold her first great-grandchild, a moment of joy she had once feared she might not survive to witness. In her final days, she often told visitors that securing her grandson's happiness had been the last great achievement of her long life, more meaningful to her than any of the estate's considerable holdings or the ancient title itself. She left behind, in a private letter addressed to Alina alone, a message expressing her deep gratitude for the transformation Alina had brought about in Alexander, and her certainty that the future of the Ashcombe family rested in far wiser and kinder hands than it might have otherwise. Baron Hartley, whose family's fortunes had once seemed destined for permanent decline, found his final years transformed entirely by his daughter's marriage, not through any direct financial support that might have compromised his own dignity. For Alexander was careful never to offer charity in a way that might wound the old man's pride, but through the simple, practical assistance that naturally flows between connected families, better prices negotiated for crops, introductions to reliable merchants, and the quiet, steady confidence that comes from knowing one's family has finally found solid ground after years of uncertain footing. He lived to see his grandchildren grow, and he never tired of telling anyone who would listen the story of how his overlooked, quiet daughter had become a duchess through nothing more than honest kindness, and the simple courage to be herself in a world that too often rewarded performance over genuine character. Lady Priscilla Ashwick eventually retreated from the more prominent social circles of the county, her reputation never fully recovering from the public exposure of her scheming, though she lived out her remaining years in comfortable, if diminished, circumstances. In a strange twist that few could have predicted, her daughter Charlotte, freed from her mother's relentless ambition following her own eventual marriage, became one of Alina's closest friends within county society, the two women bonding over shared experiences and a mutual understanding of how thoroughly the pressures of their world could distort even well-meaning families into cruelty. Charlotte often confided to Alina, in later years, that she had felt a strange, unexpected relief on the night Alexander made his public announcement, having never truly wanted the burden of a title she did not feel prepared to carry, a burden her mother had wanted for her far more than she had ever wanted it for herself. The old chapel where Alexander had first spoken so directly of his feelings became, over the years, a favorite spot for the couple to retreat to whenever the demands of managing a large estate grew particularly heavy. They would walk there together on quiet afternoons, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes deep in conversation about the challenges facing their tenants or the future they hoped to build for their growing family, and they never once passed through its ivy-covered archway without remembering the moment when Alexander had first declared, with complete sincerity, that he intended to see Alina again, whatever anyone else's expectations might demand. The estate itself flourished under their combined stewardship in ways that surprised even the most skeptical observers who had once doubted whether a duchess raised in such reduced circumstances could possibly manage the considerable demands of her new position. Alina's practical understanding of careful resource management, combined with Alexander's genuine dedication to the well-being of every tenant under his care, transformed Ashcombe into one of the most well-regarded and prosperous estates in the entire county, a model that other noble families began quietly studying and attempting to replicate in their own holdings. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Alexander and Alina's courtship became, over the years, a quiet but persistent challenge to the rigid expectations that had governed noble marriages for generations throughout the county. Young women who might once have felt pressured to perform calculated charm in pursuit of advantageous matches began to see, in Alina's example, a different possibility, that genuine character and honest kindness might prove more valuable in the end than any carefully cultivated performance of desirability. Young men who might once have felt trapped by family expectations regarding suitable, sensible marriages began to see, in Alexander's example, that genuine happiness sometimes required the courage to defy convention entirely, whatever risk that defiance might carry. Alina herself never forgot the lesson she had learned during those painful weeks of doubt following the storm, the lesson that fear and other people's cruelty could so easily convince a person to abandon something true and valuable before it had the chance to fully prove itself. She carried this lesson forward into every aspect of her new life as Duchess, encouraging her own children, as they grew, to trust their honest instincts and their genuine feelings rather than allowing fear of judgment or gossip to govern their most important decisions. On the anniversary of that first great storm each year, Alexander and Alina made it a quiet tradition to spend an evening together in the same library where their honest conversation had first begun, lighting a single candle and talking long into the night about everything that had happened in the year since, and everything they still hoped to build together in the years ahead. It became, for both of them, a sacred and private ritual, a way of honoring the strange, unlikely chain of events that had brought them together against every expectation the world had placed upon them, and a reminder that the truest connections often arrive not through careful calculation or convenient arrangement, but through simple, honest moments shared between two people willing to be genuinely seen by one another, regardless of the risk that honesty might carry. Their love story, in the end, became not just a private happiness shared between two people, but a lasting legacy that shaped the character of an entire estate and inspired countless others throughout the county to believe that genuine connection, however unlikely its beginnings, was always worth the courage it took to pursue.